Welcome to TriloTalk. This is a podcast dedicated to topics that we think are important to the profession of medical writing. And our goal is to bring topical issues to the forefront and hopefully spark conversations in the wider domain about these issues. I'm Julia Fianich-Klaproth, Senior Partner at Trilogy Writing Consulting, and I'm here today with Douglas Phoebe, another Senior Partner at Trilogy Writing Consulting. And Douglas has just written an article about writing responses to questions from regulatory agencies after you submit your dossiers, and it's titled Medical Writing, Responding to Questions from Regulatory Authorities During Review of CTD Submission Dossiers. And it was recently published in the autumn issue of the journal International Clinical Trials. And we're going to explore that topic today. So good to have you here with me today, Douglas.
Thank you, Julia. Good to be here.
So, Douglas, you and I have been supporting teams with writing the submission dossiers for almost 30 years, and we frequently follow on to then help those teams answer the questions that come in from the agencies while they're reviewing the dossiers. And in fact, I was thinking about it. We gave our first workshop on writing responses. It was about 15 years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Something
Seems
like that.
Yesterday, but it was 15 years ago. Yeah.
I know. And to be honest, the things we talked about then are just as topical today. Really, nothing much has changed. And I think that's why your new article is so relevant. So, Douglas, what was one of the first things you would tell a team if they had to go get ready for handling responses? What are the things medical writers need to have in mind to get ready for that?
Well, I think there are many different aspects to this, and responding to teams is really a microcosm of all the different facets of what it takes to get documentation in general together. But here you're dealing with a very specific situation. And obviously, the first prerequisite is to have the team available for handling those responses. And that
Indeed.
may sound more obvious than it really is, because you're coming off the tail end of a CTD submission. That can be very stressful. It can be, in many different dimensions. And so you have this tendency to sort of say, okay, got the submission done, I'm moving on to less stressful things, or picking up on other stuff I was doing beforehand in that direction.
Or taking vacation.
Well, or even thinking like, I'm out of here and traveling the world or something like that. And I think, as we'll explore, the process is really quite different depending on where you're expecting your responses to come from. And of course, in today's global world, that can be kind of like, in some ways, a parallel kind of process. So you're dealing with multiple different regulatory authorities, potentially providing questions more or less in parallel in the same time frame.
Yeah.
So having your team is absolutely essential, and that means either educating them and preparing them so that they don't get the feeling that they can just like leave the project after the CTD submission has been completed, but that there is another phase that continues then for at least probably another year or so.
Yeah. The educating is I think that's the appropriate word. I have frequently, as the dossier comes to a close and everybody's starting to think about scattering, held sessions where we sit them down, we make lists, we tell them what's going to happen next, depending on whether it's an FDA or an EMA or whatever type of submission, and assign responsibilities to people and say, you have to be available to do this. Tell them about what the process is going to look like, what to expect for
right, exactly. That's right. And that what to expect, you can, in the ideal world, and I think often we try and see the ideal world. We're obviously very familiar with the real world, but the ideal world is that you should really be sensitizing the team to gathering issues as they're preparing the CTD, because what you're doing is you're preparing your CTD to try and minimize questions after you've submitted it. But obviously you're against a time frame, and all too often we hear like, oh, we haven't got time to really drill down in this topic too much, but we'll wait to see if we got a question on it. Yeah. And And that's okay, not optimal, but it's okay. But then it's important to have a process in place to capture that issue, and ideally have, if there are new analyses required or different analyses or something like that, that you have people lined up to do those as soon as they get the time to do that, so that you basically are well prepared, because being prepared is really the main part of this, in terms of not only the having a team available, but also on terms of the topics that are most likely to be needed to be addressed.
Yeah, and as you're pointing out, it goes beyond just the key stakeholders, just the content authors. You need to have data programmers. You have to, there's a wider scope of who that team is that has to be available depending on what type of questions come in and what's needed. You referred in your article to this team as the rapid response team, which I know is pretty widely used in the industry. And we often call those things that we're keeping note of during the dossier writing rapid response topics. I always keep a list of the rapid response topics so that by the time we get to the end, I usually have a half a dozen things that the team is frequently sort of debated, and we decided maybe not to really get into too much detail because that might be something that'll come up later. And I think, yeah, having an idea or thinking while you're writing the dossier about what kind of questions are likely to come up afterwards is really getting ready for the situation.
Right, exactly. And I think one of my seminal experiences in this was a very complex submission that we did even before our 15 years ago workshop that involved 4 different indications. It involved some serious safety concerns that raised a lot of questions. They were concerns which weren't black or white, they were very gray. And it was very important that we actually captured these issues, and we had a spreadsheet to actually just note them down first of all there.
Right.
And to assign like functional areas that are responsible for preparing preliminary responses, or for preparing having the analyses prepared if there were additional analyses to be prepared. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And what we notice now, working for a whole variety of different clients, is some are much more willing to do that kind of upfront preparation, and others are rather resistant to invest in the time, in the resources, and at the end of the day, the cost for something which is really like an insurance policy. And I think those preparations are really like the insurance policy, that you're well protected if those questions come along, if something should happen that you have to address those.
So maybe just to help listeners understand a little bit about the urgency of getting these responses done, tell me a little bit about the regional differences and expectations that happen for the responses.
Right. Well, this is one of the most fascinating parts, and really underscores why not only is it important to think like the topics, the subject matter, but also the logistics involved. And here in my article, I look at 3 different major regions, so the ICH regions, so the US, the EU, and Japan. And these 3 together really offer a spectrum of situations as to how the dossier is reviewed and how questions are gathered and returned back to the applicant. So if we take the FDA, this is the most challenging situation for us as medical writers, and for us as people who have to resource people into responding to these questions, because the FDA has a system whereby you basically submit your dossier, and from that moment until the action letter, which is for a standard submission 10 months after the submission date there, you can receive questions. And you can receive any number of questions on any topic across the entire program. So from CMC, non-clinical to clinical, and through to labeling. And basically, you don't know when they're going to come. You don't know how many questions are going to come, and you don't know what topics they're on. So you need a lot of preparedness to respond to these questions when they come in with no notice. And then not only do the questions come in at no notice, but they also have a timeline attached to them. And
Right.
there isn't a standard timeline for that. So if it's something which the FDA has perceived as being a relatively straightforward topic, then they may say, we want to have your answer in 2 days. And then you're scrambling. You've got to get that answer back. Now, of course, if that's totally impossible because the only person in the company who could respond to that is not available, then you have scope to get back to them and give a rationale for why that response will be later. But by and large, if the FDA specifies a time frame, then you are held to maintain that time frame and respond to that.
Yeah,
So,
and it's not like you can say, oh, we need a month extra to respond to it.
You're negotiating. If they want a couple of days, you can be lucky if you can push that out a few more days there.
Yeah.
If you have more complex requests, and sometimes you have multiple questions and questions within questions, you sometimes have requests for new analyses, then the time frame is typically a little longer, but it's not generous. So that's the first learning from this, is that you, particularly with the FDA, you never have enough time. And that's
it's the
why,
Wild West.
Right. So that's why you need a rapid response team. And I use the FDA as the most extreme case. We'll come along to the other regions in a minute, but it's really like you need to have everyone lined up and understanding what they need to do, rather like in the pit stop of a car race. Yeah. So when the car needs to come in to have the tires changed, you don't want people looking around. So who's it going to be changing the tires, and how are they going to do it, and where are they going to do it, and have we got the tools all lined up? Not at all. You've got everyone lined up. You've got everyone waiting. They see the car coming in. They've got their tools. The tires are there, and they are well rehearsed in getting that completed, and so that the car can go out in time. And that's the mindset you need for the FDA. Now, having said that, that mindset is also applicable to responding to questions in other regions as well, because time is always of the essence. I think that's absolutely clear. So if we move on to the other situations, probably the opposite extreme is Europe, which has a very structured review process, and it has a very rigid structure for when feedback is going to be required from the applicant. And there are two main times when questions are going to come. So you still don't know how many questions are going to be. You still don't know what the complexity of those questions are going to be. But what you do know is that 80 days after submitting your dossier, the so-called day 80 milestone, you get an initial assessment report, which is a list of questions that gives you a very, very good insight into the reviewer's way of thinking, but it's not a binding list of questions. It's a draft assessment report that you're provided as the applicant as for informational purposes. It's a preview. And that is really the big difference to the FDA. In the FDA's process, you have no preview at all. You just get the questions and the clock's running. For Europe, you can plan, because you say, okay, let's use the time before day 80 to do our homework. We know the weaknesses of the program. We know those analyses we never got around to doing. And we can, in the best of all worlds, do our work up on that. Day 80, you get the questions. They're going to be very similar to the day 120 questions, which are the binding questions, the actual list of questions that you receive.
Yeah, in my experience, they're at least 90%. Not identical, but 90% similar.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's, I think, pretty much the case. There may be a few fewer questions. There may be a few more, but by and large.
And the interesting thing is that you sometimes have the same type of question, but they've worded it slightly differently. And I think we're going to get into this later, but that's one of the reasons why I try to urge people not to try and write in that preliminary phase the perfect response, because sometimes the nuance of the question changes slightly. You want to get your thoughts together and get ready for answering it and knowing what you need to answer it, but worry about fine-tuning it once you have the final set.
Yes, I think that's a really valid point, because it's good to capture thoughts, to capture key messages. But when you're responding to the questions, it's really important to read the question very carefully to see
Yes.
exactly what they're asking. And this is where those nuances can occur between day 80 and day 120, because when you're responding, you want to make sure you understand the question and that you then provide exactly the information they want. And our experience is sometimes a question comes in and people will look at it very quickly and say, oh, that's on that topic. Yeah, here's a load of material that we've worked up for some other purpose. You can use that. And actually, when you look at it, it's not what's being asked. And the risk, of course, is you just dump it into a document, say this is the response to question 5, and send, and that's what you provide. But then you'll just risk having another question on that.
Exactly, because you've missed the mark.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Europe then has this procedure where you then go through essentially the same process. So after day 120, you have 3 months. Essentially, that's the guide to respond to the questions. So again, sounds generous, but it's not a lot of time, because you've got a lot of questions potentially to answer in that time frame. And then the review continues. Day 150, you get another kind of like initial assessment report. It's called response assessment report at day 150. Again, that's a preview of the actual questions you could receive on day 180. So yeah, that's the predictability of Europe.
Nice and structured.
That's right. I mean, you don't know how many questions, you don't know what they're going to be on, but you do know when they're coming at least.
Yeah.
If we turn to Japan, it's a very different kind of process. And I would say very loosely, it's a kind of hybrid between the US and Europe. So there's a meeting that occurs 60 to 90 days after submission of the dossier, in person typically, between the applicant and the PMDA. And at that stage, the applicant will have been provided with around up to 20 questions on major kinds of topics that they will discuss at that meeting. And then about 30 days after that meeting, there will be then the list of questions from the PMDA, which can be also numerous. And then the clock starts, and you have approximately 30 days to respond to those questions.
Oh, right. Okay.
As well. That is the major sort of question and answer incident.
So you have 30 days to respond, but if I'm not mistaken, you also have to plan for translation, right?
Right, exactly. So that is, of course, the trick, and that depends a little bit how you're going to respond. Sometimes for some programs, we've just been told, okay, the Japanese team is dealing with the whole response package, so we didn't have to worry about it. But sometimes it's a global team effort, and that's where you have to plan in the translation, because the subject matter experts are all in or outside of Japan, and then they have to work up the responses with the writers, of course, and you have to plan in that translation process, which you would typically maybe even need to plan 2 weeks for that. So
so that really shrinks down the amount of time you have to write.
Exactly. So again, you're in that sort of rapid response scenario where you have to be very quick, structured, and ensure you get the responses back.
You can't just wait until you get that final list and start going then.
No, that would be not advisable, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got an understanding now of why there's this urgency, and let's talk a little bit about you dealt with this in the article, getting ready, preparing the team, and how you manage once you start to get the questions and whatever scenario, how you manage that process with the team so that you can stay structured and focused.
Right. So we typically have had a rapid response team meeting, which is certainly regular, but it depends a little bit which region you're dealing with at the time. So for FDA questions, we had daily rapid response team meetings just to track progress. And I think the main incidents there are that when the questions come in, you need to keep a tracker of those questions, who's responsible, which time frame, when something is going to be due. Then not only when a draft of the response is due, but who's going to review it, when are they going to review it. They need very clear instructions on these things so that everyone's aligned on expectations. Because the clock is ticking, you've got a draft out there, but that may not fulfill all the requirements. Who is going to provide input and who's going to sign off on this as the company position? Because these questions are very decisive in forming a reviewer's opinion of whether the drug is worthy of approval, whether the benefit risk ratio is appropriate for the drug that you're dealing with. So I think the main thing is to map out the whole process, have names and dates against every milestone within that process, and that would include translation if you're dealing with Japan as well.
Absolutely.
And not to be underestimated, then the compilation of the responses. So typically you would want to, I think, carve up the questions. So if you get a package of questions from the EMA, say, for example, that you carve them out according to functional area or in one file per question, something like that, may be easier so that you can then direct these things. Of course, that does mean you have to keep track of these things. Where are they? What stage are they at?
That's why that tracking sheet is so essential.
Exactly.
Because I completely agree with you. The first thing I do when I'm working with the team is explain to them why you need to break it down. My general preference is to do one document per question and consolidate them only at the end. And it's a rolling review. And the reason for that is some are really quick. You get them done fast, and others go through multiple rounds of review. Sometimes they even go out to external experts. And you don't want to be trying to keep track of the ones that are going through this long, arduous process in a big, heavy document that has all 150 questions in it. That's just unwieldy.
Exactly. Absolutely. I mean, that would be essential in my view to have that exactly what you described, because also, I mean, it enables you to work up some parts earlier and get them completed, because sometimes you have appendices that need to be gathered as well by people. You have analyses that need to be published into a response, and then the important thing is to have a roadmap to compilation of all the components.
Right.
Because that is also not to be underestimated, that just getting the final package together, it doesn't happen spontaneously.
Oh, no. And that's actually an extra column that I keep in my tracker. Any additional documents that are needed to support this question. Is it references? Is it appendices? Who knows what? Sometimes you even have a little separate sub-report that you write about the topic. Let's say it's safety. I remember once we had an issue. It was about diabetic retinopathy. We had a group of experts write a report about the issue, which then became an appendix to the response to the question. So you can have multiple types of documents that you need to append.
Absolutely. And to come back to the tracker and the topics and the messaging there for you can track the questions. We in this big project, we then had key messages to respond to those questions. So we put those in there. But what's also absolutely essential is to have the source of the data which are substantiating those key messages, because we ran sometimes into situations where people weren't really sure where the information was even. And you can waste an awful lot of time trying to track things down. Like, oh, yeah, I got that from so-and-so, but where is it? Where is the actual validated information that we can use in the response? So it is very multifaceted, and project management and tracking is absolutely essential there. And you need to have enough people involved so that you don't have one person juggling 10 different balls at the same time, because you'll never get it done.
There's so much going on all at once. Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great method and primer for understanding how to stay on top of this beast that you need to be keeping control of. I'd like to move on to something else that you touched on, which is actually how to craft the response, what you need to be saying and doing. And there was a lovely phrase in the article that I just want to point out that we can use to talk about. And you said the responses need to be as long as necessary and as short as possible. And I couldn't agree more, because often I find when you're working with teams, particularly if you bring in some external experts who are a bit more academic, they can easily go off on tangents and start trying to talk about things that have nothing to do with the question that's been asked. And it's so important that the writers keep the teams and the response itself focused on just answering this question and nothing more.
Right, exactly. I mean, that is absolutely rule number 1, 2, and 3 is stay focused on what is being asked.
Yeah.
And answer what is being asked, and don't answer anything else.
Yes.
There.
Yes.
Because if they wanted something else, they would have asked for it. You know?
Exactly. So, yeah. Just answer the question.
Yeah. And I think also to be factual as far as possible, realistically interpretational, but to be plausible in the response there. And sometimes there are insurmountable issues, or seemingly insurmountable issues, which you basically have to say, okay, we do have an issue here, but then this is what we would propose to mitigate that, if that's the sort of scenario you're in, rather than trying to sort of go off on tangents, which may not be relevant to actually trying to resolve the issue that's being asked, in the question.
Or worse, it can take the agency someplace you don't want to go, like proposing a new study. Oh, well, yes, if you just did a study on that, then you'd know, wouldn't you?
Right. And you certainly don't want to go that route. I mean,
and that's another reason you want to avoid speculation. You don't want the response to sort of disintegrate down into speculating about things. Stick to the facts, stick to the relevant topics and the data you actually have to support that.
Right. And another important aspect is that when you're responding to questions, you're not meant to be bringing in new data that the reviewers haven't had access to. And that's often a bit of a challenge, because in many programs, there's still studies continuing, and data are coming in, and the data that do come in may actually be highly relevant, but they may not be final data. They may be only draft analyses of some of the patients in an ongoing study or something like that, which show a trend, but you can't bring that in. So your responses have to be in the context of the data that the reviewer has had access to.
Isn't there, there's some exceptions. You're absolutely right, but there's some exceptions, isn't there, where sometimes you tell them you're going to present some data during the response or something like that. There's some exceptions, I think.
Well, I think, I mean, it really depends on where you are, what the data are, etc. Yeah. But as a general rule, I would say that there shouldn't be the temptation to try and bring in some immature data that look good, but they're not ripe. And then you may find that by the time you've got the final data, then it's it's a different picture. And I think the other thing is that, of course, if you've got a completed study, it's been reported, the data are all final, and it's absolutely answering a question that was being asked, then of course that may be a different situation, and that could be a matter of negotiation, of course.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think the last recommendation that I always give people about how to write these responses or what to think about is, when you're writing them, make sure you're giving the reviewer what they asked for, and don't expect them to do the work for you. So if they've asked for something that you think is there already, don't just say, well, it's in listing 86. Either they didn't see it and now you're making them feel silly or foolish for not having seen it, or they might have asked for it because they'd like to have it in a format they can easily copy over into their assessment report or something, and they're asking for it for a reason. So don't just tell them where it is, give it to them. Just remember, these are human beings. They might have overlooked it. That's okay. This isn't the time to get snide. Don't make them have to go and look for stuff. If they're asking for something, or if it looks like they haven't seen something by the nature of their question, give it to them again.
Exactly, and I think the not only is that very important, but the tone of responding is very important. You have to remember you're dealing with human beings on the other side, as you said, and you want to keep them in a good mood.
Yes,
and they're under stress in terms of a limited time frame to do their work.
Yeah.
It's possible they overlooked something, in which case, as you say, one can in a very polite manner just say, no problem, here it is.
Yeah.
Give it back to them again. I think sometimes they may ask for information that's essentially there, but it maybe the messaging wasn't so clear. I mean, we see a lot of submission dossiers provided to us by our clients, and sometimes they're written not in the way we would particularly like to write them, and we say, well, really, we're not seeing the message there, and that could be the situation reviewers also been in. And sometimes you just need a different form of presentation, maybe a figure instead of a table, or instead of a long paragraph of text, have a figure which illustrates the point. It just may make things clearer. So I think that is anything you can do to make their lives easier is going to help you as the applicant to have your drug approved. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, at the end of the day, these reviewers also have to write some form of an assessment report. I certainly at the EMA and the FDA, I know, and you can help them because if you give them in response to their questions, nice, pre-digested, well-presented information, they will just copy and paste that and use it in their report. So you're actually helping them get their job done, which makes them feel a lot better about the situation rather than frustrated with you as an applicant. Yeah, I think so. I think the human element is also not to be underestimated. I mean, we all, think, okay, the facts are the facts and the facts are what are going to drive the opinion. But at the end of the day, there's always a little bit of a kind of emotional component to how you may get to that goal, even if you do get to the goal, via one route or the other. So, yeah, a very important point from my side. Yeah, great. Well, Douglas, it was a pleasure talking to you today. I think this was a very interesting topic that a lot of people don't necessarily get to hear about very often. So I really enjoyed having a chance to just chew the fat with you on it. Well, been my pleasure. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Yeah, you're welcome. And everybody, do go out and try and get your hands on the copy of the article that Douglas has just brought out. It'll be worth the read. Thanks, Douglas. Take care. Yep. So thank you for listening to TriloTalk today. If you enjoyed it, please come back and listen to us again. If you have feedback on this or any of our sessions, we would love to hear it. In addition, if you have ideas for future topics that you'd like us to cover, particularly something you think the community should be talking about, let us know. We would like this to be an ongoing conversation with medical writers at large, and you can send us comments on our Twitter feed or on our LinkedIn page. Just a reminder, you can find all our episodes of the TriloTalk podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and trilogywriting.com/TriloTalk. Have a good rest of your day.